So I'm going to ask about one more building, then I'm going to wrap up because I've taken too much of your time. The Queen's Theater. And I bring that up because it's sort of, it's in contrast to this, but not quite. It's the theater that's in, describe it, please. Just describe the program and where it's located, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, a lot of our buildings, the program that comes to us, the brief, is sort of a list of spaces as a point of departure, and very often it ends up being reconfigured by the time we've gone through several iterations of the design. Typically, to come to a concept, in Weeksville we came, there were 3 major initial iterations of the design and probably 20 other explorations that didn't quite make it to the finals. Queen's Theater, we certainly went through that process where we went through 10 or 15 different concepts, and we had gone along fairly far with the development of one of the concepts, and then the owner of the project, the initial brief was it was like, give us a new lobby and maybe an elevator for the stage and
but more importantly, where is it located?
Because
it's a very loaded site.
Right. So it's funny, these things come to you in this kind of weird informal way, just like you're saying, when in fact the site is so much more loaded. It's a really, you sort of cut to the chase. So the site is the Old World's Fairgrounds. It's a
64, right?
64. This particular complex is the old New York State complex by Philip Johnson.
And also people should, just to orient people a little more, that's where the is it the U.S. tennis finals?
Right.
And then the Met Stadium is very close to that also.
Right. So it turns out that this Old World's Fair Park, Flushing Meadows Corona Park, is one of the largest, most heavily used parks in New York. And right in the middle of it is this huge complex from the 64 World's Fair, one of Philip Johnson's best works, but it was designed to be torn down after the fair closed, and instead New York State turned it over to the city, probably in an effort not to spend the money on demolishing it, and said, "Oh, here, we'll give you these buildings."
A gift.
A gift. And so the observation towers and the open-air pavilion part of it have remained unoccupied since 1964, so we're talking 50 years almost. And there was a third little structure called the Theaterama that was like the first open-air 360 view when you went inside this open-air drum of slides of, this is New York, or this is New York State. So that drum got rebuilt into a civic theater in the late 80s, early 90s. And they hadn't really had a chance to build a real lobby. Then it turned out that they were successful enough, they wanted another venue, a cabaret. There was no backstage, really literally. There were all these complications with it being in the middle of this park. And so they hired us to do some minor renovations, and minor grew and grew and grew. And kind of wandered all over the place. So it was a series of these design explorations. But we started to come to the conviction that at the heart of the problem was that the 90s structure threw off the Philip Johnson composition very badly, so that it was very confusing where the center of the whole complex was and where the point of entry was. And there wasn't any kind of if you think about successful theaters or the Met or any kind of theater at any scale, what happens between the acts and before the acts and after the performance is part of the whole experience. And so you have to have a gathering space,
Absolutely.
in addition to your theater seats, where these things can take place. And we slowly began to realize, especially for these nonprofits, that having a major civic space where people could gather was also a way of extending their purpose as a community institution where borough-wide receptions can take place and weddings can take place and bar mitzvahs and sweet 16s and all these different celebrations. So we could call it the party room for the borough. And it started out with all these contrasting forms, and finally our client said to us, you know, I've been in this building for 15 years, and it's a circle. And why can't you guys design a circle? So in the end, that was such a, like, and of course, once we did embrace that, then we didn't want to reproduce Philip Johnson's exploration of circularity. That wasn't a respectful way of responding, but we did recenter his axes because he had a very axial solution. So we placed this party room at an end of an axis so it's the kind of thing where it feels right now, and it didn't feel right before.
Yeah.
And the circle forms, they became more and more complex, as we really started to explore what variety of spaces you could compose out of these different circular movements.
The original was actually an oval.
Right.
Which oval is much more dynamic than a cylinder.
Yes.
And I was always afraid of
But it's
the
also
cylinder.
directional.
Directional also. And Michael over there came up with, I didn't know how to handle the cylinder because it's just a static space.
Yes.
Michael came up with the spiral.
The double spiral.
And the spiral part is what then resolved the staticness of the oval.
Because they were sort of
You're
feeding
coming-
each other.
Feeding into it.
Yes.
And then terminating in a dome.
Yes.
That instead of being upward is downward. So the cylinder, which is static by its nature,
Yes.
solid,
Yeah.
became activated by the circulation movement.
But it's no longer cylinders, it's two spirals now.
Right.
No, it's still a cylinder.
Right.
But the spiral is coming in, modifying the cylinder.
Correct.
Right, and the dome reflects, it's interesting, the dome already existed in the oval, the inverted dome, but then
Yeah.
when Michael's spirals, we added that to the cylinder, then automatically we reinserted the inverted dome
well, you need
because
it-
the cylinders were pointing, the spirals were pointing to something, and so you had to terminate that movement.
The thing of spirals is that they go on and they go on and they don't end.
Right, right.
But so you have to terminate them.
Mm-hmm.
Terminating in an upward dome
Right.
still means continuity.
Yes.
Terminating it down means stop.
Right,
Yes.
spinning around that.
And that added then another tension because between for the body,
Mm-hmm.
standing there with a thing coming down on you,
Yes.
going out to the glass box,
Yes.
sets up another tension.
Right.
And also too, I was reading, because I haven't been there and I need to go there now, that you decided that the termination at top would not be a hard termination. You wanted to sort of a gradual termination. And you were looking at Rothko,
Right.
the sort of
Sure.
Rothko to sort of, the colors sort of fade
Right.
as they go up there, which I thought was great.
We had problems architecturally. We were told that it should have been.
Yeah,
graded.
contractors would be like, well, come on, how are you going
No,
to?
other architects thought
Oh,
that
really?
you go from, like you do a watercolor, you go from, one tone to another tone to another tone, right? But that.
I know what you're saying.
That would be an approach.
I know that is one approach, but that is the
Right.
That's a lazy approach. I mean, you, not only Rothko, but you think of Turner and you think about other people. It's sort of you're talking about what we talked about being sort of naturalistic at the beginning. Sort of those are sort of more natural ways of doing things. Rothko is in a weird way, you know, and there's so many, there are different sort of periods of Rothko, but the Rothko that everyone knows, on the surface it seems geometrical, but when you sort of, then you get lost in it. It's
Right.
not geometrical anymore.
Right. And
Pretty spiritual. Back to that thing where you were talking about architecture that moves you. So we look at the work of artists a lot, and we try to understand it as deeply as we're capable of. And we do take lessons learned from these great artists and try to reflect it back in architectural explorations.